we should be good to go. All right, any questions on that one? You're not going to use it too often, okay? If I have a choice, I'd probably use fill it over that. But if I'm fill it, remember, it's going to give me an arc, okay? So if I want that cutoff corner, that's a chamfer. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple of ways to extend objects, trim objects, okay? And what they call break and lengthen. So they all kind of do similar functions. So I'm going to go ahead and clean my screen up. Just take this guy out. We're going to look at extend first, and then we're going to look at trim second. So they are basically the same command. They're kind of inverses of each other, okay? So when you do an extend, I'm going to just draw a line like this. And I'm going to draw a line like this. Okay. You have to have a minimum of 2 objects when you do an extend. A minimum of 2. Now I can have more than that, but I can't just have 1. And one of the objects is called your boundary edge. So if I want to take this object right here and extend him to here, I have to have a boundary edge to take him to, okay? So the first thing you select is what we call the boundary edge. So the natural way that most people do is they'll start selecting the objects they want to extend, and it won't work, okay? You have to hit the boundary edge first, and then the object to extend second. And you can have multiple boundary edges, okay? Multiple boundary edges. So you can have more than one, certainly, and you can have more than one object to extend. So extend is noticed up here. Right now, mine says trim. Buried underneath trim is the extend command. So I'm going to go to extend. You can also type in its alias, which is EX. Okay, so if you like typing, EX, enter. Notice what it's asking you here. At the top, it says select boundary edges. Okay, it's real sneaky. But down below, it says select objects. So a lot of people think, oh yeah, I want to start selecting. If I want to extend this guy right here, that's what I want to select first. What it's really saying is select the boundary edge first. Once you're done selecting the boundary edge, then you hit enter. Now you can select the object to extend, and when I pick this guy, notice he goes into it. Okay, so he basically just pushes that endpoint out. Is everybody seeing how that works? Okay. Yes? No? Is that a no? You're good? Okay. So remember, boundary edge first, objects to extend second. Okay? Go ahead and hit the escape key if you're following along with me, and then do an undo, because we're going to add a couple more objects, okay? So not all objects extend the same way, and not all objects extend. The only types of objects that will extend are objects that have endpoints. Okay? So lines, p-lines, and arcs. That's about all we've talked about that have endpoints. Circles obviously won't extend, ellipses, points, none of those kind of objects will extend. So they have to have endpoints, okay? So we're gonna draw something. I wanna show you, you got this guy here. What I'd like you to do is draw an arc. And I'd like you to do a 3-point arc just like this, okay? And I also want you to draw another line over here, and I want you to shoot it past the boundary like I have there, okay? Because I want to show you what's going to happen. So arcs are tricky. This arc, as we look at the way I drew it, does everybody agree that this guy could extend to that line? Everybody good with that? What about this side? Would it extend to that line? Right? Should, right? That follows around. But an arc can't go both ways, okay? Because if you take an arc and then take it one way, if I take it this way and then I take it that way, what will happen? Let's see, I'm not sure. Somebody. Okay, I guess that wasn't to me. All right. So this line or arc to that arc, if these come together, what kind of object would you have? If you brought the two arcs together and you get a circle. So AutoCAD does not let you turn an arc into a circle, okay? So we'll see that. All right, what's going to happen on this guy? Is there a boundary edge on that line that I got my cursor on? Is there a boundary edge there? If I extend this thing out, is it hitting anything? Right? There's nothing out there, correct? Does everybody agree with that? But mathematically, this guy could extend to infinity. So it's possible to extend something that's not actually hitting an edge, okay? But I'm going to show you. It probably won't work right off the bat. So we're going to have to turn a setting on. So I'm going to go back up to extend. We're going to select this guy again as our boundary edge. Okay? And then when we're done, we're going to hit enter. So if we come over here and select this, he extends. Come over here to the arc, he extends. If I try to do that side, it won't let me. Because if you did that, it would turn it into a circle and it won't let you. Everybody see that? Now let's try extending this line. Mine won't extend, right? Because there's no object out there to extend to. But mathematically, if we took that line out, that line could extend infinity in both directions, right? So you can do that in here. Notice there is down here what's called edge. So at the bottom, we're going to go to this edge option. And notice the edge option is set to no extend. So that means it's not going to recognize that this guy exists out here. So if you set it to extend and then come up and touch this object, bam, there he goes. He extended out to the point where it would actually hit if there was a line out there. So that's a little switch or a toggle. If it's turned off, it won't work, okay? And if it's off, it stays off. If it's on, it stays on. So once you turn it on, it stays on, okay? There's reasons to have it off, and there's reasons to have it on, okay? That still will not affect that circle, though. That circle will never extend, or that arc, rather, it'll never extend. Okay, is everybody good with that? This is a great tool. We're going to use this a lot. And we can do the same thing with fillet, okay? But this is a little bit more effective than a fillet, okay? So you can extend with a fillet, but now you have a command that just does strictly extends, okay? Is everybody okay? All right, so now we're going to take a look at trim, which is kind of the inverse of this if you want to think about it. It also requires a minimum of 2 objects. Okay, minimum of 2 objects. You have to have what's called a cutting edge, and then an object to cut. So for this to work, you have to physically be crossing an object. So here's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to take this line, I'm just going to click right here, and I'm going to move it till it crosses through those objects. Okay? You guys can do the same thing, or you can just draw a line that comes through objects. Don't care really how you do it. Okay? So trim, just like extend, requires your boundary, but they call the boundary for a trim a cutting edge. And then you're going to have the objects that you want to cut. Okay? So we're going to go into trim, and that's now buried underneath extend. And the alias for that is TR. So if you typed in TR and hit enter, you could also get to trim. So again, this one's sneaky. If you look at it, it says select cutting edges. So what you're really doing is selecting your scissors first, okay? You're selecting the scissors. So I'm going to come up here, and I'm going to call this the cutting edge. And then I'm going to hit enter. So now, we are in a trim mode that if we select an object, it's going to trim that off. So remember, what you select is what it trims. Okay? So if I come on this side of the line and click that, he's going to trim there. But if I come on this side of the line, he's going to trim there. Okay, so what you select is what it cuts. So if I come here, it cuts. If I come here, it cuts. Okay? If you don't like what you did, they have an undo in here. You can undo it back. I can come over here. Okay, well, that one didn't do anything different. So, but you do have the undos. If you make a mistake, you can undo them back. The edge mode should be also in effect there. Mine set itself back to no extend, but if I do it to an extend mode, now when I cut, notice how it cuts that arc differently. This one won't trim because it's not crossing anything. Okay? If it's just touching your cutting edge, it won't trim. It has to physically cross it or mathematically cross it. Are we getting that to work? You guys in the back okay? Okay. All right. Is everybody getting this to work? No? So let's go into trim. Trim. Select him. Hit enter. Now select what you want to trim. Okay. You didn't hit enter probably. So after you selected your cutting edges, that's when you hit enter. Okay. All right, so I'm going to show you a little trick. Trim command and extend command are basically the same command. Okay, they're just inverses of each other. Are you guys okay in the back before we move on? Okay. So you have to select the boundary first, and then the objects that you want to trim. Okay. Are we good? All right. So here's a really cool thing about trim and extend. They're the same command, and all you have to do is hit the shift key to make one the other. Okay. So if you're in the trim command, you hold the shift key down, it's going to extend. If you're in the extend command, you hold the shift key down, and it's going to trim. So what we've got here, let's just go ahead. Do you have a question? Okay. So go ahead, and then you can just undo what you've got there if you want. So we'll bring back what we had. Okay? So we're going to now go in, and we're going to go into the trim command. Trim. So here's another little trick. You can make every object on that screen a cutting edge or a boundary edge, okay? And you don't have to select. All you have to do right now is when it's asking you to select objects, is just hit enter. So if you just hit enter, every object on there is either a cutting edge or a boundary edge, but it will also be able to extend or trim. So it kind of goes both ways. We started out in the trim mode. So if I select that, it's going to trim. And if I select that, it's going to trim. But if you hold the shift key down and then select, it extends, release, it's trim. Okay? It's pretty cool because what I'm able to do is trim or shift, extend. Trim, shift, extend. So if, oops, that one's not doing it. So you have the ability to go back and forth depending on what mode you're in. So if you started out in trim, when you hold the shift key down, it extends and vice versa. So it's really pretty cool because you can make every object a cutting edge or boundary edge, and then you can also shift and go back and forth. Hit the shift, hold the shift key, hold it down, hold the shift. This is, no, you just cancel. Okay. Go back into here. This is the shift key. Hit trim. Hit enter. Okay, so hold the shift key down. Hold the shift key down. Click on this. Hit extend it. You see that? Now release it. Release it, and it'll trim. Okay. You see how that's working? It's going to take a little getting used to. It gets easier. Definitely gets easier. Okay. So let's take a look at another command that it does with trims and extends, but it works a little differently. It only requires one object. So I'm going to go ahead and just clean up what I've got on my screen. And I'm just going to draw a simple line here, like that. So this command is called lengthen. We find it under here, right at that point right there. So what I did was I went to the modified panel, opened up the modified panel. That first row right there, third point over, is lengthen. So if we choose lengthen, notice there are 4 sub options: delta, percent, total, and dynamic. So delta allows you to tack a little piece on by adding a delta angle, like say, or a delta distance on this side, or a delta distance on that side. And it's not really adding a piece, it's actually going to shoot it out. So it's actually going to take where the endpoint is and make it bigger. If your delta value is a plus, it adds. If your delta number is a negative, it subtracts. So you can use this command for trims or extends, and it only works on one object, okay? So you don't need a secondary object. Percent does exactly what it says. If you want this thing to be 50% or half as big, you would type in 50, select it, and it just trims it. Total's really neat because it allows me to say, I don't know how long that line is, but I want it to be 2 inches, okay? So I can take any line of any distance and make it a value just by using lengthen, total, okay? So let's try delta. I don't use the dynamic, by the way, too much. So let's go select delta. Notice the value there is 0. I'm going to make it, let's say, a +2. So I'm going to put 2 in there and hit enter. So now notice when I come up to that line, if I go to this end, notice it shows me it's going to extend it. If I go to this end, it's going to extend it. So whichever end you click, it extended, it extended. So you can kind of think like what you're doing is adding little pieces to it. It's really not adding pieces, though. It's pushing that endpoint out. Okay? All right, let's try this differently. Go ahead and hit the escape key. Go back into lengthen. Let's set your delta distance to negative. Let's say -5 and hit enter. So in this case, it's going to trim 5 units, trim 5 units, trim 5 units. Okay? So that one's that's a cool option. You can go either way with it. Right? You don't have to have an object out there. And that works with any object that has endpoints, arcs, p-lines, lines. Okay? So let's take this one and look at it. Go ahead and hit the escape key. Go back into lengthen. Let's take a look at total. Total's really neat. Type T for just check total. And let's say we want to make this exactly 2.5 units. So if I type in 2.5 and hit enter. So watch what happens when I come down to this end. Notice what it's doing is it's holding the opposite end fixed, and it's cutting it this way. Now, if it needs to lengthen it, it'll add it, so it depends on how long that line is. Mine's obviously trimming. So if I come to the other side, though, it'll do it from the other direction. So you have to notice that when you're using delta, for the side you're picking is what it's adding to or subtracting from, but with total, it holds the opposite end fixed, okay? Holds the opposite end fixed, and when you click on it, there's your line. If I would list that line out, it'll tell me that that line is exactly 2.5 units long now, no matter how long it was initially. Whatever I set that total to, that's what it is. Right. That's an awesome little tool. Probably one, excuse me, it's probably one that a lot of people don't use that much and probably should use more. Okay, definitely. All right, so we're gonna kill that. Gonna draw a line here. And I'm gonna draw a circle. All right. So the next one we're gonna take a look at is called break. A break is definitely just a trim, okay? So with break, what you do is you pick 2 points. Like you say, pick a point here and pick a point there, and it's gonna break from the first point to the second point. You don't have a secondary object there, it's just picking 2 points. Now you could have objects that are crossing or something like that, but in general, if I'm going to do that, if I have crossing objects, I'm probably going to use a trim. It's going to be easier. Okay. One thing that's really cool about break that you can do no other way is to break an object at a point so that it's still touching endpoint to endpoint. This is the only way you can do this using the break command. Okay. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So we're going to find the break tool. It's also in the modify. You have to open up the little drawer. They actually have 2 breaks here. That's your normal break command, and this is what they call break at. I'm going to show you how to do that just manually. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this tool right here that says break. Okay. Now watch me do this first, and then I'll explain it. When it asks you to select the object, wherever you pick is the automatic first point of the break, and notice wherever I drag my second point, it's breaking between the first point and the second point. So think about that. If I'm just picking an object, that's not being very specific, is it? Right? So you're not getting a direct correlation there of anything. You're just picking a point and it's going to the second point. So we can be specific, and we can also force the break differently. Okay, so here's how we can do this. Let's go back into the break command. So select your object. Now notice there's a first point object down there as an option. What we can do is say, I don't want the point that I selected as my first point. Okay? I'm going to force a first point by using something different. So what I can do is hit, okay, first point. And then it's going to say, okay, show me or specify the first breakpoint. I'm going to hit a shift, right click. I'm going to go to the midpoint. Come down here and snap to the midpoint of that line, and then I can come up here to say, passed it, and what I did was broke it from the midpoint out. So I can be very specific, but if you don't choose the first point option, it's not going to work right. Okay, did everybody see how that worked? Now circles and arcs are really tricky. They want to break counterclockwise from the first point to the second point. So if I choose the first point here and the second point here, it's going to blow that out. Okay? So I'm going to show you how to do this, but you got to remember they break counterclockwise from the first point to the second point. Okay? So we're going to break this circle. We're going to break. Break. Going to select your circle, and notice as you drag it how it breaks. Okay, you see that? It's breaking kind of weird. What we want to do is go to first point, and I would like you to hit shift, right click, quadrant, select that top quadrant, and then we're going to hit shift, right click, quadrant again. and choose that quadrant. And notice what it broke was from the first quad to the second quad. All right. So break is a little tricky. It always does a trim. And if you don't force the first point, it's going to take just wherever you pick it as your first point. Okay? So a lot of times, if you've got a choice, do I use extend, do I use trim, do I use what? Probably want to use trim and extend most. Okay? So these things, you have kind of more limited applications. So here's the really cool thing about break, that you can do no other way in AutoCAD. If I want to break this line in two, such that they're still touching endpoint to endpoint, I could use the break command. If I use the trim, I'm actually going to have a little piece that's missing. Even if it's really small, it's always going to be missing. They're not going to be touching. Okay? So here's how you do this. You have to force the first point and the second point to be equal. The first point and the second point have to be equal. So what we do is this. We go into the break command. We select the object. Go to first point. And what I'm going to do is do a shift, right click, grab a midpoint. All right, so notice it's trying to break there, right? So who can tell me, anybody know how I can make the first point equal to the second point, or the second point equal to the first point, I guess I should say. Say it again? Type it in. Type what in? Yeah, so in other words, I could O-snap again, right? Okay, but there's an even easier way. The @ symbol in AutoCAD means the first point. So if you just hit the @ symbol, which is shift number 2, you get the @ symbol and then hit enter, it'll do that for you. So you don't have to do another O-snap, grab it and select. So you could do exactly snapping, or you can just type in the @ and you did it. Now you look at that line, it doesn't look like it did anything, did it? But if you click on that line, you'll notice, oh, there's a line, and there's a line. And they're actually touching endpoint to endpoint. Okay? That is the only way you can do that in AutoCAD, by doing that methodology. Okay? Any questions? All right. Yes? The @ symbol? Or you asked me about the @ symbol?
I mean, no, you say @ symbol with something.
@ symbol references last point. So when you snap that midpoint, that's your first point. It's also the last point you entered. So if you want to reference it back, you can just type the @ symbol. You want me to run that again for you? Do it again? Okay. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to break this. I'm going to break that circle, okay, at a quad. So what I'm going to do is go into break. I'm going to select my arc. And then I'm going to choose F for first. So I'm going to force that first point at the quadrant right there. So notice that thing wants to break. You see that? But I don't want it to break. I don't want it to break there. I want it to break right at that point. So all I have to do is type in the @ symbol and then hit enter. And what it did, if you look at this, there's 2 arcs there now. Okay, and they're broken at the quad. But they're also, what's more important, this is really important to understand, they're hitting endpoint to endpoint. Okay, they're definitely endpoint to endpoint. All right, is everybody okay with that? All right. So we're going to take a look at join. So join is a really neat little command. It'll allow you to bring objects together. We talked about explode. Explode blows them apart. Join brings them back. Okay. So if we're going to just go ahead and delete what I got here. And I'm going to go into align command and just pick line to line. So I'm going to pick lines like that. Okay. So these lines are not joined together. They're touching endpoint to endpoint, but they're not joined together. Okay. So we can join them together, and when you join them together, first the criteria is they have to be touching endpoint to endpoint. They can't be crossing, or they can't be missing each other. Okay? They have to touch endpoint to endpoint. If they're not, they won't join. Okay, so I'm gonna intentionally move this guy to show you that this guy will not join with the rest of them because he's not touching endpoint to endpoint. So we find the join command. Let's see, I think they call it right there. It's next to break. And I like to use the alias J. I just type in J and that goes. So you select that. It asks you to select your objects. You can do one at a time, or you can do them like with a crossing. Okay? So theoretically, whatever's highlighted there should join up. So once you're done, just hit enter. And you'll notice it says at the bottom, mine says 3 objects were converted to 1 polyline, but 1 object was discarded. So that means that this one didn't join, but these guys are now 1 polyline object. And once you've converted them to a polyline, you can give them width, and you can do all those other kind of things you can do with polylines. Okay? So join is taking objects that aren't together, brings them together. It also converts them into polylines. Okay? So that's a really cool little guy. The reverse of that would be explode. So if I have this guy highlighted and I hit the X key and hit enter, I just blew him apart. So this is now a line, and that's a line, and that's a line. And notice that one never joined in because it wasn't touching endpoint to endpoint. Okay? Question? I selected the objects, and then I just hit the X key, which is the shortcut for explode. Okay? You can also find explode. You can find explode up here in the modify panel. Notice that little box that's exploding. Looks like it's blowing that box apart right up here. That'll do that for you too. So it's the reverse of join. And it's kind of neat. All right. So if you have a polyline, remember, and you explode it and it's got width, it'll lose the width. Okay. But once you convert it back into a polyline, then you can give it width. Okay. So those are all nice options. Everybody getting that one? Pretty cool. All right, I want you guys to draw something for me. We're gonna take a look at the rotate and the scale command and then the align command. So we're gonna kind of look at all 3, but I want to show you them in steps. We're gonna do rotate first, then scale, and then one of my favorites, which is called the align command. So let's go ahead and we're just gonna erase that garbage there. And I want you to draw a little flag for me. So we're gonna do, there's the shaft of the flag. I'm going to come out, pick a second point, then I'm going to use a third point, and I'm going to use an O-snap called nearest to just snap to it, make it look like a, well, that didn't grab it. Try that again. My O-snaps aren't working. So you should have one that looks like that. When you get it kind of looks like a flag, just click on it and then hit enter. So we got the shaft of the flag and the flag itself. All right? And it doesn't have to look like mine. So rotation does exactly what its name implies. It's going to take an object and rotate it either counterclockwise or clockwise. Anybody remember clockwise? Is that positive or negative in AutoCAD world? It's negative. So if you want to go counterclockwise, that's a positive rotation. Clockwise is a negative rotation. So the other thing about this is when you rotate, you have to know what your rotation angle is, what direction you're moving it, clockwise or counterclockwise. You also have to give it a base point. So think about that as being like you're sticking a pin right at that point, and that's the point about which the rotation is occurring. But that pin, I could stick that pin up here, I could stick it there, I could even stick it over here. So where you give it the base point doesn't have to be on the object, but I'm going to tell you probably a good 80% of the time it is. Okay. Otherwise, the rotation will be kind of strange if you come off of it. All right. So the rotate option is used quite frequently. So you notice it's out here on the panel right there, right next to move. So we're going to go into the rotate option. And the first thing it wants to do is ask you to select objects. So I'm going to go ahead and select all of the objects that I want to rotate. That's another thing that's really key. If you want to rotate your entire drawing, you've got to make sure you select every object somehow, because if you don't, and you do a rotation, you could have a bunch of objects left behind. And that could be a problem down the road, okay? So I'm selecting all 3 of my objects. Once you see your objects selected, hit enter. Then it will come back and it will say, I need a base point. There can only be one base point, and we have to be selective. So I'm going to use an O snap. So I'm going to use an O snap. I'm going to shift, right click, grab the endpoint O snap, and I'm going to snap it to the end of the bottom of my flag right there. Once I do that, notice I'm kind of in what they call a drag mode. It's actually physically dragging it this way, or it's physically dragging it this way. So what you're actually doing is you're eyeballing an angle. Okay, you're eyeballing an angle and you're eyeballing a rotation. Neither of which we usually do. We want to be exact. So notice also it says specify rotation angle or reference it. So there's physically 2 ways of doing this. Just giving it an angle. Positive will go counterclockwise, negative will go clockwise. Or you can reference it, which means I don't know what the angle is, but I know what I want this thing to be at when I get done. So I'm going to show you both options. We're going to look at providing it an angle first, okay? So we're going to just type in an angle. Let's type in 30 degrees. So here's what that did. If your angle was at some value already, it just added 30 degrees to whatever it was, okay? It's not saying it's 30 degrees off of X or Y. It's just 30 degrees added to what was already there, or subtracted from what was already there, okay? If you're going to do that, you better know the exact angle, okay? In my business, mapping, we get into rotation issues sometimes where the guys out in the field have screwed up the angle, and they might have screwed it up by 5 degrees and 30 minutes and 3 seconds. So when I rotate, I have to get that exact. Otherwise, things are not rotating exactly into position. Okay? So it's really, really critical when you do rotations. Where the base point is and the amount you're rotating it and whether it's plus or minus. Okay? So let's say we don't know what that is, all right? We know that we want to have it, let's say we want this thing to be straight up and down. But we don't know, and probably nobody here knows what that angle is, okay? I would have to know what the angle is from this shaft over to the 90-degree position. I don't know what that is, and I don't think I couldn't even figure it out that easily. But what I can do is reference that shaft on that flag, and AutoCAD can calculate that for you to 14.6 So that's called a reference option, okay? So, but we need to be very precise, so that's where we gotta use those O snaps, okay? So we're gonna go back into rotate. We're gonna select the same group of objects. Make sure you get all 3 of them and hit enter. We're gonna base point at the same spot. So shift right click, grab endpoint for my base point. So notice it's asking me for an angle. I don't know what that angle is. So we're going to go to this option called reference. Reference. So what it wants you to do is show 2 points on that line. So it'll measure that angle, and then you can tell it what you want it to be. So I'm going to show it a point at the bottom. I'm going to O snap end, and I'm going to O snap the top. Notice how now it tracks right along that. And it wants to know the new angle. The new angle is the angle with respect to the x-axis. Okay, so if we want that thing to be straight up and down, what would be the angle with respect to the x-axis? 90 degrees. no matter what angle we were all at, if we type in 90 degrees and hit enter, that thing should be shooting straight up and down. So it calculated, in my case, it calculated whatever that was, which was maybe 5 degrees and something, but it did it to 14 sig figs. Okay? So the two options, and depending on what you're doing, be really careful with this because it's an easy one to get wrong. And particularly if you have to select every object on your screen, that could be an issue. Okay? All right, so we're going to take a look at the scale command. Scale is in the same column, but it's in the bottom row there. So scale is going to allow you to increase the size of your objects, decrease the size of your objects, and it's kind of a lot like rotate. You give it a base point, you give it a scale factor. If the scale factor is greater than 1, it'll increase your objects. If it's less than 1, it will decrease the objects. If your scale factor is 1, what's going to happen? No change, right? No change. All right. So we're going to go into the scale command. Select your objects. Hit enter. Base point. So the base point with scale is also critical. The base point doesn't move. So if you pick the base point right at the bottom of the flag, that's fixed. The scale will work out from that point. If I pick it, watch this. I'm going to pick mine off to the side. Don't you guys do this, but I'm going to pick it off to the side. Notice now as I increase the flag, it's also increasing the distance from the base point. Okay? So if the base point isn't on the object will increase or decrease, but it will also move. Okay? So there's a big difference. Okay, so if you did that, just go ahead and hit the escape key. I'm going to go back into the scale, select my objects, hit enter. I'm going to give my base point at the bottom of the flag. So that means it's going to be fixed at that point. Notice that point's never going to move. The coordinates of that are not going to change. But the coordinates of everything else on that flag are going to change. Okay? All right, so if we type in 2 and hit enter, your flag should be twice as big. And the scale factor works in the same direction. So the scale factor in X, the scale factor in Y, and the scale factor in Z is all 2. You can't have a scale factor of 2 in the Y and 1 in the X. Okay, AutoCAD doesn't let you do that. Some programs do, but this one doesn't. So the scale factor is a constant. Did everybody see that? If we go less than 1, it scales down. So they also have a reference option, and this is really neat. This allows me to calculate a scale factor on the fly. In other words, it'll calculate your scale factor to be able to get your distance what you want it to be. So here's what I'm saying. I have no clue how big that shaft is on that flag, but I want it to be exactly 5 units. So if I knew how big it was and what I want it to be, I could figure out my scale factor, right? But I can just show AutoCAD those 2 points, and it'll calculate the scale factor. That's called a reference option. So if we go back into the scale command, select this guy right here, hit enter, base point it. I'm going to base point it at the bottom, end point. Okay, notice we're in that mode, but notice there's a reference option. So I'm going to go down to the reference. And it's going to say, okay, show me a length that you want me to reference. So I'm going to pick with an O-snap from that endpoint to that endpoint. So notice now it's dragging right with that. So I want my shaft and my flag to be exactly 5 units. So I'm just going to now type in 5 and hit enter. Ooh, mine got really small because obviously it was way bigger than that, right? If I went out and listed this distance right there, it's going to be exactly 5 units. Everybody see that? It's exactly 5 units. And it calculated that to 14 sig figs. So you don't always know your scale factor, okay? That's a really cool option. a very cool option. And I use scale a lot because some people work in decimal units and some people work architecturally. If I bring a decimal drawing into an architect drawing, it's usually 12 times smaller than it should be, or vice versa. So I can import an architect's drawing into my drawing and I just divide them by 12 and it scales it down and fits it in, or vice versa. So scale is a really highly useful command. Okay, you guys get any idea? All right, we're gonna do one more because I want to give you guys some draw time today. I'm gonna just do one more today, and I'll probably on Thursday. I just want to go over a few things, the array and some of the other things, so we'll be good to go with that. So I'm gonna just go ahead and we'll erase this, and I'm gonna show you a real cool print. So this is one of the coolest commands out there. All right, so let's do a rectangle. Let's draw a rectangle over there in that corner. And I want you to draw a line for me, just kind of an inclined line. Don't worry about its size or its angle, just like that. Okay? So here's what I want you to do. I want you to pick that block up and paste it on the midpoint of that inclined plane, and then rotate it to the inclined plane. So what would we have to do that? What would that take? Well, we'd first have to what? Move this object using the move command, and then we'd have to do what? Rotate it and figure out the angle, right? So that would take us as a minimum two operations. And do you think we'd get it right? Maybe yes, maybe no, right? Well, there's a command in AutoCAD that will do 3 things for you in one. And it's called the align command. And a mathematical name for this is transformation. So what it does is it translates, which is a move, it rotates, and it scales all in one. It'll do a move, a rotate, and a scale. And it really does it in that order. It moves it first, it rotates it, and it scales it. Okay? This is a really, really awesome command. So we find this under the modify, and it's located right there, the align command. So we're going to select the line. The object that we're going to align the rectangle to the inclined plane, not vice versa. So we're not going to select both objects, just what we want to align to the other. So I want you to select your rectangle and then hit enter. Okay? What it's asking us for now is to specify a source point. So a source point is a point that's on the object that you're moving. So again, we want to use very precise O snapping. So we're going to shift, right click, end point. I'm going to snap to this, and I'm going to bring that guy over to the destination point, which is going to be shift, right click, mid. So what it's doing is drawing, that's called a displacement vector. That's what it's going to use to calculate the move and the rotation with. Okay? It needs to know a second source point. So I'm going to use the top front of this or the bottom front. Shift, right click, end point. My second source point is going to be the end point up here. So I'm going to hit a shift, right click, end point. So I get I get 2 displacement vectors. This is what's called a 2D transformation, so I only need 2. You might notice right now it's asking me for a third, and that would be if you were in 3D space. So for instance, if I had an object sitting up here, and I want to bring it down here, I would need a third point. So I'm not going to worry about a third point, just hit enter, and it's going to ask you if you want to scale the objects based on the alignment point. So what that's saying is the distance from here to here right now is bigger than the distance there to there. If you want to scale it, it'll scale it at the same time. Okay? So if you say no, it won't scale it. If we say yes, we do. Let's just hit enter and watch what happens. you'll notice real quick it doesn't move and it rotates. Boom. And it should be looking like that. Does that work for everybody? Did we get it to work? That's a pretty incredible command. And like I said, we're doing what's called a 2D transformation. You can do it three-dimensional as well. Okay. You just need a third source point. You definitely have to utilize O-snaps though. You just don't want to eyeball any of this stuff. Okay, O-snaps are so critical. If you're not picking up on those are something that you might want to ask me questions about to help you out with. Okay. All right. We good? Okay, so I'm going to stop the session. I'm going to walk over to the other room real quick, make sure those guys are good. I'm going to stop this recording. Hopefully it took for me. I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then